So thank you all for joining us today. My name is Dr. Taylor Clem with IFAS Extension Nassau County. I'm the County Extension Director, as well as the horticulture agent and Master Gardener Volunteer Coordinator. And just kind of get everyone oriented to what you're seeing. So this is on a Zoom webinar, so you don't have the ability to share your screen or your camera, but you do have access to a chat box and a Q&A board. And anytime throughout the presentation today, feel free to put any comments or questions into that Q&A. So then I can respond to them throughout the program. But don't worry, at the end of the program, we'll have an opportunity to be able to ask questions and stuff like that. So today's program is called Florida Friendly Landscaping Program Crash Course. So our goal of today's program is to really orient everybody and make the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program familiar to you, and why it's important, because, you know, as we think about our landscapes and how our landscapes change, you know, that Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, it is our statewide program through the University of Florida, where we really think about how are we conserving water the best ways possible, how are we managing our landscapes the best way possible, not only because it saves us money, but it also helps with conserving Florida's water resources and our natural resources. So before we really dive into the program, I do want to ask a couple questions or show you some things, kind of talk about why this program is important. So have any of you seen this map before? You can put this in the chat box or anything like that, and I can see it. So this map is the state of Florida. So what we're seeing in the state of Florida is this is from a plan called a Florida 2060 plan. There is the new Florida 2070 plan as well. But what that plan is, it's kind of a joint project between the University of Florida as well as Florida's Department of Environmental Protection. But this Florida 2060 plan really looks at how we're thinking about land use change, but also how we're thinking about how Florida is going to change over the next 50, 60, however many years into the future. This is an ongoing project that's updated, but this data specifically comes from the Florida 2060 plan. And what we see on this map is, what we see on this map in the state of Florida is there's a couple different things. The red, what we're seeing, that's developed areas. So that developed areas is predominantly things like residential, commercial, institutional, industrial, anything where like the land has been cleared or changed and built upon. So that's that developed space. So this is just from 2005 data, you know, and that was 16 years ago. So we really start to think about, you know, we can see that it has changed significantly probably just since then. The green color, that is conservation area, and that conservation area is permanently protected. Conservation, whether it be a state forest, state park, national forest, whatever it might be, it's in conservation. So it's always going to stay in conservation. The rest, that is kind of like our agriculture, undeveloped spaces, anything that doesn't fall within that developed space or that permanently conserved space. But one of the things that we do know is that Florida is one of the fastest growing states in the country, just period. It's one of the fastest growing states. And based off of this data, we know that from when this 2005 snapshot was taken, that we can anticipate and expect our population to double by 2060. So that's how this data plan got that name, Florida 2060. So we know that the population of Florida is going to double by 2060. And when we actually look at the data, we're ahead of the curve. So it's happening a little bit quicker than we anticipated. But so what we do is we think about how our landscape and land use trends exist. So how is Florida changing? How is it developing with single family homes, PUDs, typical construction? And we look at that as kind of like a model on based off of certain development patterns, we can anticipate how Florida is going to grow and change over that time period to 2060. So when we start to think about what do we anticipate Florida development to look like in 2060, this is the model, this next image is what that anticipated growth pattern will look like through this study. So we can definitely see that there's a significantly higher amount of, excuse me, there's significantly higher amount of development that is occurring. And, you know, we could theoretically zoom into Nassau County specifically on this map, and our development patterns are keeping right in line with what kind of this pattern is showing for Nassau County. But we're seeing that there's a significant amount of growth around that, you know, that St. Pete, Central Florida area up into Tampa, Clearwater, et cetera. And, you know, because of the villages being one of the big fastest growing networks or communities, that explains a lot of that growth that's happening there. But just that's where a lot of development is happening. And you can see that still throughout the nature coast is left a little untouched. But this is a huge change in the character of Florida based off of that influx of population that's coming in. So that really makes us think why this could be important, because as that population grows, it's expected to double from that 2005 to 2060. And with that expected population growth, that means there's going to be an increased demand for water resources and how we're using it. That means that there's an increased susceptibility of pollution or impacts to our water bodies and our waterways. And because of that land use change, where we're taking out some of these on these areas that are not in conservation and removing them, there's a decrease in habitats. And a lot of those habitats or natural habitats filter polluted runoff before it returns to the aquifer. And we start thinking about land use and water use throughout the state, we do know that approximately 60% of homeowner water use in Florida is attributed to lawn and landscape irrigation. So that is significant. 60% of water use. And this came from some studies back in the late 2000s where we got some of this updated numbers where we're able to develop this figure, but 60%, that's a lot. Now, of course, if you don't have irrigation, you don't fall into it, but that's just kind of like a rough average. But 60% of homeowner water use is attributed to lawn and landscape. So as the population grows, we're trying to think of like, okay, so how can we conserve and protect water, especially within our landscapes, when it accounts for 60% of that residential water use? Because excessive water use not only depletes our aquifers and our water reserves, it costs more when you're irrigating inefficiently because it costs a lot of money to use some of the water. But as also, if we don't irrigate appropriately, it's really easy for us to contribute to a lot of the pollution, like nitrogen and phosphorus through like our fertilizers. That any type of runoff that we contribute or not following those best management practices that we'll talk a little bit about as part of this program contribute to a lot of those algal blooms that we see throughout the state. So like when we see about green algal blooms or like those fish kills that are happening, landscape maintenance or how we're managing our landscapes has a strong connection and contribute towards those significantly. So there's a bunch of different ways that contribute towards those nutrient loadings and pollution that can lead to those algal blooms, but residential landscapes is a major source of it. So that's why the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program is really important, because it tries to overcome these issues of excessive water use within the landscape and also making sure that we're reducing and using and managing our landscapes appropriately to help protect Florida's water quality. So at the end of today's program, I want you to be able to answer these two big questions. You know, there's no quiz, but this is just kind of like help guide us through the program today. Is what is the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, and why is the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program important? So before we jump into the details of the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, are there any questions that anybody has about the water use or the land use change questions or topic that we covered? And you can put those in anything in the chat box or the Q&A. All right, so we'll just go ahead and we'll keep going. So feel free to always put questions in there if you have any. So the Florida Friendly Landscaping. So we call it FFL, the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. Well, it's called the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, but people refer to it as Florida Friendly Landscaping, Florida Friendly, FFL. But I mean, what is it? So it is an integrated approach to really maintaining an attractive, colorful, yet a diverse yard. So it's essentially any landscape in any yard that has specific aesthetics of what you want it to look like can be Florida friendly. It's just a matter of how are we going to maintain it. So it needs to be friendly to wildlife. That's one of the things is like, how are we controlling pests, which we'll talk about, is how do we make sure that our landscapes are helping contribute to, as habitats are fragmented, wildlife and pollinators, et cetera, could potentially use our landscapes as a place for like butterflies, pollinators to reproduce, have shelter, water, food, et cetera. And then the neat thing is a Florida friendly landscape. And we actually compare a Florida friendly landscape to a traditional Florida landscape, which is like your typical landscape that you see when you move into a new development or home. The Florida friendly landscapes are less work than a traditional landscape. And I put in kinda because a Florida friendly landscape is just like any other landscape. You can opt to make specific maintenance decisions, like on specific plant material that might require to go out to do additional extra work here and there. But on average, the Florida friendly landscapes are less work than a traditional Florida landscape. And the ultimate goal of the FFL program is to conserve water, protect water quality, and I could add it is provide, help protect biodiversity or help support wildlife habitat. So we actually did a study a few years ago that is now published, actually got published in April, where we did a full study between a Florida friendly landscape and a traditional Florida landscape, and where we looked at the amount of work that went into it, but we also looked at all the other inputs. And one of the biggest things that we noticed was the huge savings in water. So I want you all put in the chat box, kind of a guess. What is that percent savings that you think that we had of the Florida friendly landscapes? Because the Florida friendly landscapes used less water, but what percent savings do you think it had compared to like the traditional Florida landscape? How much less water did it use? Wonderful. So there's some that say like, I saw like there's a 30% less, 25% less, 40% less, 60. So it's we're kind of all over. So there's a couple close answers. So the Florida friendly landscapes, we actually, the reduction was huge. So the FFL only used 13% of the water compared to the traditional Florida landscape. 13%. That's how much water it used compared to the traditional Florida landscape, which is a huge reduction, significant reduction. And a lot of it started because we've just followed the principles of the FFL program and the university's best management practices on how to manage landscapes. And essentially what happened, and I'll talk more about it, is we were able to turn off the irrigation system and the plants happy and thrived. Majority of our water that we used in that landscape was just during that establishment period, and that included turf grass. We had turf grass in those spaces. So that just kind of just shows you a numerical value that, man, that's a huge saving. So we're talking about reducing our water to help think about that doubling population. We theoretically, if every home across the entire state was able to reduce and follow Florida friendly landscapes, then what we would be able to do, is essentially already meet the water demand needs for that population when we double. So it's like, wow, the solution's there pretty easily with the technology and knowledge that we have now. It's just, we got to do it. So it ends up equating to about an 85% less water use. So it's a pretty significant reduction. So it's not only, turning off the irrigation system, but how we're putting water on the how we're putting water into the landscape. So I had a question that popped up, and this is going to be a great question. I'll actually save that for the first principle that we talk about. So the question is, what grasses fall in the FFL program? So we'll come back to that here in a minute. So when we're thinking about the Flora-Friendly Landscaping Program, there are 9 principles that we kind of use to guide us. And these 9 principles, you know, as a homeowner, it's like you can focus on 1 or 2, but you'll end up finding that as you start to follow one, it's easy to the others start to fall in line pretty successfully. But those 9 principles, and we're going to talk about each of these today as part of this crash course. The first one is right plant, right place. Second one is water efficiently. The third is fertilize appropriately. Fourth is mulch. Fifth is attract wildlife. Sixth is manage yard pest. 7 is recycle. 8 is reduce stormwater runoff. And 9 is protect the waterfront. And I like this little statement that is on this slide as well. It says Flora-Friendly Landscaping is a collection of practices involving design, installation, operation, and maintenance, which are intended to reduce irrigation water use, protect water quality from overuse of fertilizer and pesticides, and reduce stormwater runoff. So let's talk about each one of these slides today, or each one of these principles today as it's part of this crash course. And as part of our extension programs, what we will end up doing is we'll have programs where we focus on a couple of these different principles and how they can be applied. So, you know, this is kind of like the brief run over of the 9 principles, but we'll have different programs that we can really jump into more detail in the future nonetheless. So the first principle is right plant, right place. If you follow right plant, right place, that means that all the other principles can easily fall in line. So if you're thinking about how do I make a Flora-friendly landscape, start with right plant, right place. If you put the right plant in the right place, you're not going to have a pest issue or a very minimal pest issue. You won't have to irrigate that much. There's going to be very little maintenance and management that is required to maintain that landscape, and those plants are going to be happy, healthy, and thrive. So it all starts with right plant, right place. So right plant, right place, there's a couple conditions that we think about. So when we're thinking about right plant, right place, it is we are planting, putting plants in a location that meets their environmental preferences. Or say you're, another way to say it is, say you have a landscape that has full sun, you're not going to put a plant that likes part shade or full shade. You want to put a plant in there that likes that full sun or prefers those full sun conditions. Because anytime that we plant a plant outside of its preferred conditions, it's not going to be happy. And what happens is it's going to end up being stressed, which once a plant is stressed, you might as well just invite every pest and disease and pathogen in, because you're going to have to deal with them. As well as if we're managing them properly, that's going to bring in pest and disease and all sorts of management issues. But it starts with right plant, right place. So there's a couple things that we need to think about for right plant, right place is the environmental conditions. So making sure that our plants prefer the environmental conditions that we're putting them in, as well as think about function. How is that landscape going to be used? And then one thing that's commonly forgotten about is how big does a plant get? So I have some landscaping pet peeves. And one of those landscaping pet peeves is when you put sweet viburnums in front of windows. So you want to make sure that you keep your windows open and clear. But if you have a sweet viburnum in front of a window, you're going to always have to prune it into a hedge, and it doesn't like being pruned into a hedge. And a sweet viburnum wants to grow to be about 20 feet tall. It's actually better classified as a small tree or large shrub. And so that's kind of like one of my landscaping pet peeves is we don't always think about how big a plant gets when we're making those plant selections. So it's important to think about how those plants change over time when you're making a selection. Function really focuses on how will the landscape be used. easiest example that I can think of for function is turf grass. So the question that we have earlier is like, what grasses fall in the FFL program? You know, any turf grass, as long as it's not invasive, because invasive plants are out of the question, no invasive plants. But any plant that if you're putting it in and it matches those environmental conditions can be a Florida-friendly plant. You know, and functionality becomes a key point of that discussion as well. So I have some kids, and in our backyard, we have some open turf grass area because, man, they go outside and they like to run around, they play, you know, do that type of thing. And that's really nice, you know, to have that space because it serves functional purpose for them, and the turf grass grows well in that environmental condition that's there. Um, so what ends up happening is that serves a functional purpose, but as they get older, they may not need that turf grass anymore because it doesn't serve the function of them being able to run around or anything like that. So maybe they want that function and how that landscape changes over time. In the future, we become empty nesters, my wife and I. So maybe that landscape changes so we can reduce that turf grass because it's not serving a function. And then maybe introduce more ornamental plants, and maybe then turn that landscape more into like a quiet place where we like an outdoor retreat, you know, so the function of that landscape changes. So that's an important thing to consider. But the environmental conditions, going back to that, that's always the big first step in right plant, right place. So we think about those environmental conditions, or those environmental conditions that can influence or impact which plants are most or do best in our landscapes. So when we think about some of these environmental conditions, I want you to put in the chat box, what are some of those things that you think of that can impact plant selection? What are those environmental conditions that we need to think about? And you put that in the chat box. Yeah. So that one pops up a lot. Yeah. Sunlight. How much sunlight do you get? Full sun, full shade, in between these. How much water does it need? You know, you're not going to put a plant that needs lots of water with plants that don't need much water. Or, you know, think about drainage, and that's one that's on here is, you know, some plants prefer really well-drained soils. Others don't like well-drained soils, and they like to have those really wet feet a lot. So, you know, what are those soil conditions in your backyard? Do you have areas that are really wet, areas that dry out pretty quickly? So that's going to help dictate, you know, some of that plant selection as well. So yeah, you all are hitting a lot of these right on the head. This is amazing. I actually can't keep up. So sunlight, drainage, water needs, climate. So climate zone. And a good way to think about that is we actually have what is called, and I'm going to put this in the chat box so y'all can see it, is called the USDA hardiness zone. And that is a standard that's kind of set up for the United States Department of Agriculture. And it's based off of general climate temperatures. And, you know, there's plants that don't like cold temps, and there's plants that don't like hot temps. So we set up these hardiness zones to kind of help dictate, you know, which plants grow well or best in those areas. And we are actually in predominantly, we are actually split. So if you're on the west side of the county, you're in zone 9B, and sorry, 8B. And if you are on the east side of the county, you are going to be in 9A. So we find that in general, that coastal area is slightly warmer. So that can dictate, and there's not too big of a difference between the 8B and 9A in plant selection, but there are some plants, very few, that you can be on the west side of the county and you can grow them great, but you cannot grow them on the east side of the county, and vice versa. But another thing is, yeah, soil pH, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So soil conditions, so there's so many environmental conditions that can help dictate. And I'll show you a cool web resource that we have at the end of the presentation on how to help with plant selection. So one thing that was mentioned is thinking about salt. Because of our coastal areas, salt concern and salt tolerance is something that we need to concern ourselves with, because sea breeze or salt accumulation can have a significant impact on plants, because plants don't like salt at all, but some just have evolved to tolerate it more than others. Like our native plants on our coastal ecosystems, those dunes and the marshes, they're totally fine with it. Doesn't bother them at all. But there are some plants, if you put them out on the dunes, you can have a windy day that brings in some of the breeze, and that plant will be dead within a week because of the amount of salt that it picked up. So salt tolerance is important to consider. So I want to go back to the question is, what grasses fall in the FFL program? So the grasses that fall in the FFL program, we sometimes classify them in two different types of grasses. We have clumping ornamental grasses, and there's so many that we can pick from in there. And we also have like our turf grasses like St. Augustine, zoysia, bahia, centipede. Those are the most common turf grasses that we use. You could use Bermuda, but I don't recommend it for a homeowner. But so there's all sorts of grasses that fall in the FFL, but it really comes down to right plant, right place. Is it the right plant for the right place? If it's not, it shouldn't be planted. So this is the first principle: right plant, right place. We're not going to spend as much time on the other slides about we're not going to spend as much time on the other principles, but this is that first start. This is that key principle that if you follow right plant, right place, everything else just becomes a little bit easier. And we'll talk about that, and I'll kind of relate the other principles back to this as we go along. And I think it's important because actually in these slides, there's actually a lot of invasive species, and as part of that plant selection process, no invasive species, because you can find invasive species actually at the nursery down the road from you. You'll have them, that like little fern that you see on the image on the right. It's on the left side of that image on the right. That's a tuberous sword fern. That's not our native sword fern, and it spreads like crazy. It's ridiculous. And you can find that locally at a lot of different nurseries, like our big box stores. Carry it a lot. And then also papyrus. Papyrus isn't a very good plant to use. So it's important to just be aware. But if you use that plant selection app I'm going to show you at the end, then that's going to really help out with that plant selection, because we remove invasive species on there. And I'll show you another website we can look at to kind of, is this plant invasive or not? But anyways, so principle number 2, this is water efficiently. So a nice thing, we're thinking about that 60% of residential water use is attributed to landscapes. And principle number 2 is watering efficiently. So how do we make sure we're reducing water use? So there's a couple ways, right plant, right place. That means, if we follow that principle, those plants get established in the landscape. Just turn off your irrigation system completely. Turn it off and only turn it on when the plants show sign of stress, of drought stress. Because if you wait till that point, when the plants start to get a little drought stressed, what they're going to do is those plants are going to develop longer, deeper roots. And as they develop those longer, deeper roots, you're going to have a much stronger plant. So your turf grass will be much stronger, your ornamental plants will be much stronger. So you actually just turn the whole irrigation system off. And you should only be irrigating at most during the warm season twice a week, and during the cool time of season once a week. And a lot of times when we have issues coming into our office about landscapes, one of the major causes is because there's excessive water use, excessive irrigation in the landscape. Because of how much rain we've had this season, you could have gotten by with rarely running an irrigation system, but if you have that timer click to auto, it may still end up running. So there's a bunch of different ways. So obviously making sure that we're following right plant, right place. You can turn off your irrigation system and only water when needed. Even if it's like a couple plants, you just go out with a hose if possible and just hit those plants if they need it. Because over water use is unbelievably common in the landscapes. And there's different ways that we can reduce water use. So with turf grass, there's constant research about what's going on about the most efficient ways to get water out there. That image that you see on the left, it's a little bit different than like those traditional pop-up rotors that throw water. This is called a micro spray micro trajectory. It uses very little water compared to a rotor, but if you're thinking about like micro irrigation, which is low volume water use within ornamental beds, this is still using more water than like a drip irrigation or something like that. There are subsurface systems for turf grass, but they break. They don't work too terribly well, so we don't even recommend those at all. But there's some really cool new developing technologies that we're going to see in turf grass irrigation. But ornamental beds, you know, those low flow systems, you see tubes that sit underneath the mulch, that is like pennies what you end up using compared to some pop-up rotors. But still, even if you use that, you know, keep your system turned off unless your plants need it. And it starts with right plant, right place. And on that image on the right, do you all know what that is? Put that in the chat box if you know what it is. Yeah, that's right. So that's dollarweed. And that dollarweed, if you have dollarweed pop up in your landscape, that is a good sign that you're irrigating and applying too much water. So there's a couple conditions that'll happen is you're applying too much water, or maybe part of your landscape doesn't drain as well. So with that water that's going on it, it's not able to leave the soil. But dollarweed is a great indicator that you're irrigating too much, or there's too much water in the landscape. And if you have your whole irrigation system turned off, yet dollarweed is persistent, then that's a good indicator that turf grass is probably not the right plant for the right place, because there's too much moisture for that turf grass to be successful. So here's a great question that came in relating to this, because as part of the timers, we do have sensors or controllers that can determine if our system should turn on or off. And the question is, are rain sensors still required by law on irrigation systems? So that is primarily dictated at the county level. And I don't think it's part of the building code, but in Nassau County, it is a requirement. But rain sensors are not reliable. And actually, the University of Florida, we are no longer recommending the use of rain sensors, because they may work the first year, but after that, they're not going to work at all. So or they lose how well they work. So the reason they do that is, well, how many of you, let me ask this question, how many of you have a rain sensor currently at your house or your property that's hooked up to your irrigation system? Yeah, I do. Yeah. So you can be honest. You're allowed to be honest in this space. Is for those, and I'm the only one seeing those responses too. Of those that have that at your system, have you ever replaced the cork that's inside the rain sensor? Someone recently got a new one, so that's good. That's good. So this wouldn't affect you, but yeah, everyone else, those that responded said no. And so that's why they lose their effectiveness. So there's a cork inside that rain sensor. So as it gets wet, it expands. And as it dries, it contracts. And how that works is once it expands to a certain amount, it says, hey, there's enough water. So it turns off the irrigation system. It turns off the timer. It says, you don't need to water right now. But because of our heat and that expansion and contraction, those corks literally just start to crumble apart really, really quickly. And unless you go in and replace that cork on a regular basis, at least once a year, your rain sensor loses its capacity to function correctly. So we actually, from the University of Florida, we no longer recommend rain sensors, yet it is the standard. It costs slightly more than a rain sensor, but the ones that we're recommending now are like weather-based controllers that actually read the weather from local stations and determines if there's been enough water in the past and what is projected in the future, which a rain sensor cannot do. But the other one that's really easy, that's cheap, that costs slightly more than a rain sensor is actually a soil probe. And it's a probe that you actually bury in the hot, sunniest part of your landscape, and you connect it up to your timer, and it's constantly reading soil moisture. And what it'll say is once soil moisture goes, once it gets too dry, then it'll tell the system that it can run. That is way more reliable than the rain sensor, and does much better job at controlling and reducing water use than the rain sensor would when it's working functionally. So there's different controls and override systems that we can put on our timers that help with it. Rain sensor is the standard, but we don't recommend it anymore because of that need to replace that cork, and it loses its effectiveness, and especially if we have technology that's more reliable and helps reduce water even further, like the rain sensor or like a weather-based controller. So anyway, so that's water efficiently. So the third principle is fertilize appropriately. All plants need nutrients. All plants need nutrients, and just really, how do we get those nutrients to the plants? Whoops. How do we get those nutrients to the plants? That's going to be key. So what do you think is the first step in thinking about how do we fertilize our landscapes? What do you think would be that best first step? You can put that in the chat box. Yeah, soil test, check your pH, understand what's happening within the landscape. So soil pH can really dictate how well your plants uptake nutrients. So like St. Augustine grass has like this ideal window of pH. And if it's outside that window, then it's not going to be able to uptake nutrients really well. And you can apply nutrients, but the turf grass won't be able to uptake it. And that actually soil pH falls into that right plant, right place, because if you don't have to make soil adjustments, which can be very, very difficult to do, and selecting plants that grow best in those conditions, that pH, that's perfect. So if you do that soil test, you can learn about the soil pH, so you can figure out which plants will grow best based off of that pH or what adjustments need to be made. But that soil test will also let you know what deficiencies you have in the landscape. So you can do we in our office, we have a very basic pH test that we can do, but the University of Florida, we have a soil lab that you can send your samples in. They'll check for phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, manganese, a bunch of other soil nutrients, because that can really determine what plants or how you need to fertilize your landscape or apply those nutrients to the landscape if the landscape is deficient. So it's really important to think that we apply based off of our science-based recommendations. And, that's a very broad term that we use because it can ultimately, that can change based off of what you're growing. But like a great example is applying nutrients or fertilizers to like St. Augustine grass. St. Augustine grass, you can get by with 2 applications of fertilizer a year, and you have to make sure you're using slow release fertilizer. And you're only applying like 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. No more than that, no less. Anything in excess, the plants won't be able to uptake, you'll lose. And then anything that's lost goes out to our water bodies and contributes to pollution that impacts our water. In turf grass, if you follow our recommendations, we actually know that in those conditions where we're managing the turf grass properly, the uptake efficiency of nutrients is almost like 99.9%. It's unbelievably high, but there's a lot of times where nutrients are misapplied or applied improperly. And then those improper applications can lead to that nitrogen and phosphorus, which are the two nutrients that pollute our waterways. So always making sure that when we're fertilizing, start off with that soil test, allow that soil test to determine what rates and maybe what type of fertilizers you need to put down, and use those results to determine, even with pH plant selection. So if we fertilize appropriately, we do know that we can significantly reduce and eliminate excess of nutrients and runoff into our water bodies. And some of these other principles that we do have lend to how we make sure we're reducing those pollutants like nitrogen and phosphorus from entering our water bodies. So, but again, if you start off with right plant, right place, a lot of our plant material, once they're established and in the landscape, I mean, you don't really need to add any nutrients. Really with turf grass, it's kind of just comes down to applying nitrogen based off of its needs. Even at that, it's very minimal. And if you're doing it correctly, then you really don't have to apply that much. But again, right plant, right place relates to functionality. Does it have a function, that serves in the landscape? Because turf grass, we do get some really good benefits from in certain conditions within the built environment, like residential communities, etc. So fertilize appropriately. And if you have questions about how to best fertilize certain things, reach out to me. We can share those resources with you. So this fourth principle, we'll keep cruising now, is now mulch. So mulch, this is kind of like a weird one. Some of us are trying to think of like, could we better write this principle? Like, how do we protect and enhance soil? So principle number 4 really comes down to helping with the soil, help conserve water, help protect water. And, when you think of mulch in your landscape, you might think of just like it helps tie the landscape bed together depending on how you're using it, which is 100% true. But mulch is a great, easy tool for the landscape. So when you apply mulch appropriately, you need to apply about 3-inch depth. So I usually say it's like your middle finger. If you can put your middle finger all the way into the mulch and still touch the ground, that's a good depth. What that mulch does, it helps reduce weeds. It helps suppress weeds from popping up in your landscape. It can help, it breaks down slowly, and it can help build organic matter within your soil. It can help keep the soil at a good temperature. So it's not cooking or frying the soil, killing all those good things that are in that top 6 inches of soil. And by keeping that temperature cool, it allows that water that's there to be used more efficiently. So you're not losing excess water. So the water that you put down is being used most appropriately. So mulch, there are certain types of mulches that we prefer. So any pine bark byproduct, I prefer using pine straw over the pine nuggets. Both work well. I prefer the pine straw because even though you do have to come in and top dress it more frequently, though all those little needles, they stick together and they create a mat. So when it's raining, they don't float off. Whereas the pine nuggets, they can float off and get carried away. So I prefer the pine straw. Some other simple things is like the leaf litter that's falling out of your trees. Just use the leaves that, drop. You can find like Melaleuca and eucalyptus mulches at the store. Those are totally appropriate to use. And the big things that we don't recommend is things like cedar or cypress, because those are harvested. Those are harvested unsustainably, and they can actually lead to problems, just like where are they coming from? They're not harvested sustainably, whereas a lot of our pine comes from byproducts, and it could be nuggets or shredded, and that's totally appropriate. But the pine, there's like usually a logo on those mulch bags that say it's part of like the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. But if you stick with pine, you're good to go. Cypress and cedar, do not use rubbers, do not use gravel or stone to be your mulch. None of those are going to be beneficial, and they're not Florida friendly. One question did pop in that says, do you need to replace mulch occasionally, or okay to keep adding on top? So you can top dress, and that should just come on with the new stuff and just pile it right on top. There are some times, like after a long period of time, you can start to see that as that material has broken down, it starts to mound up a little bit, because it's just, now you just have this rich soil that's sitting there. You can sometimes remove that and then come back and kind of start over. And then you have that rich soil that you can put in like containers or put somewhere else in your landscape and use it, because it's going to be happy, healthy. But yeah, you could just kind of just keep piling it up on top. As long as you're keeping that like 3-inch depth is going to be appropriate. So again, pine straw is my favorite, but the pine byproduct, that's going to be what is the most preferred. I do not recommend using any of the dyed mulches. Like if you can get blues, reds, etc. Just because of the concern that with those dyed mulches, the dyes can leach out, and it can impact some of the plants. So great question is, do you need to remove all the leaves before mulching? No, use those leaves to your benefit. So those leaves, as they break down, they're going to apply and supply a bunch of nutrients to those plant material. So like say you live in an HOA, leaves are like great, cheap, easy mulch that you can collect in your landscape. Don't put them in bags. Don't put them in your yard waste, use them to your advantage. So you can always use that leaf litter as your mulch. And I think I have a cool picture later that shows a good example. Let those leaves become the mulch. And if you need to be like HOA compliant, where you have to use a specific type of mulch, a specific type of Florida friendly mulch, like pine bark or pine straw, you can always just put a thin layer of that specific mulch on top so you're compliant, but you're using those leaves in your landscape to your benefit. Because if you can just recycle those nutrients, which we'll talk about here in a minute as one of the principles, that really helps your landscape out, helps provide those nutrients so the plants can create food, etc. So that's mulch. Principle number 5 is attracting wildlife. So as our urban areas are spreading, we're having what we call as wildlife fragmentation. And that's those natural areas are getting smaller and further apart. So what we can do as homeowners is we can think about, what are some of those plants that I can put in my landscape that attract wildlife? And that could be something like, think about what you need to survive. If you're familiar with like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or, or if you watched a lot of like Man versus Nature, or one of those survivor shows, the things that you always think about is you need shelter, fire, water, food. If you could provide, for wildlife, not necessarily fire, but the shelter, water, food, that is going to provide a lot of those basic elements for those wildlife to like say, hey, I like this landscape. I can come here, I can reproduce, I can be happy, I can be healthy. And then they may move on to another landscape, another natural area. So attracting and using our yards as a way to attract wildlife has tremendous benefit, not only to us, because we're having this awesome wildlife of different pollinators or birds, and you can kind of select what plants to attract specific things. Next thing you know, your yard is teeming with life. And it's remarkable to see. So using those plant selections to think about, how can I attract wildlife? Because as those habitats fragment, it's going to be really important that we do have places for this biodiversity to exist, and our yards become an opportunity to create habitat for that biodiversity and that wildlife. Principle number 6 is managing landscape pests responsibly. So our yards, our landscapes are always going to have pests, but the biggest way to control pests is just making sure that we're just managing our plants appropriately. Too much water, you're going to have insects and pests come into your landscape. You put too much nutrients or fertilizer down, here come the pests. If your plant is not the right plant for the right place, here comes the pest. So pests, a lot of these bad pests that come to our landscape are actually attracted to stressed plants, plants that are distressed plants. And that can be from excess of nutrients, that can be from excess of water. It can just be, I'm not the right plant in the right place, or I'm just not being maintained well, like turf grass. I'm cut too short, I'm not cut long enough, or things like that. So managing landscape pests responsibly really starts with what we call the cultural controls. What are those management decisions? What are those plant selection decisions that we can make to help reduce and eliminate the threat of pests coming into our landscape? Because when those plants are stressed, you might as well have an all-you-can-eat sign flashing above all those plants, kind of like attracting all those bad pests to come into our landscape. So there's ways that we can manage pests. So it's always important to think about set realistic expectations. You're going to have pests in your landscape regardless. But if you have a happy, healthy landscape, those pests are going to be in control naturally because it's not going to be an environment for them to thrive. So if you have St. Augustine grass, you're going to have chinch bugs, but are the chinch bugs bad? Are they at a population that's actually causing lots of problems? So make sure that we set realistic expectations. And then so we have those cultural decisions, we have mechanical ways that we can reduce them. Like if you have some aphids that you notice on a plant, don't go get your insecticide and spray the plant all willy-nilly. No, just mechanically, just smush them, pinch that part of the plant, throw it in a trash bag, get rid of it, pest manage, and so we always look at how do we manage these different pests? There's those cultural controls, there's the mechanical controls, we have biological controls. And a great example of biological control is all three of these insects that you see on here. So you have a lacewing, that's a beneficial insect that goes after bad pests. That ladybug, you can see he's going to town on an aphid. Ladybugs are great for controlling some pests. And then that insect on the left, that is an air potato beetle. And that air potato beetle is actually biological control for our invasive plant, the air potato. And say cultural controls don't work, those mechanical controls aren't going to work, and there's no biological controls. And usually by starting with those, that's going to manage majority of pest problems. And if none of that works, you can go onto this chemical applications and thinking about how do we manage these pests responsibly and following the label for use of these insecticides or pesticides. Because when I talk about pests, it's not just insects, it's fungal problems. It can be viruses that pop up in your landscape, any nuisance in your landscape. And when we manage these landscape pests responsibly by following right plant, right place, you're going to significantly reduce how the impact they're going to have on the landscape. But it's important to make sure that you're monitoring your landscape appropriately. So we talk about scouting. So it's like, every 7 to 10 days, or the time that you're outside, just look around. Are you seeing signs of pest problems? Because it's easier to get them under control when the population is small compared to if it's just running rampant across your landscape. So that regular scouting, just as you walk around the yard, do you see any signs, concerns of insects? You can look underneath some leaves, look for those things. Because if you can isolate a problem and fix it then and there, cool, you solve the problem from getting much, much larger. Principle number 7, that's recycling yard waste. So this goes back to that statement I was saying earlier about leaves. It can be as mulch. This is the image I was referring to on that top right. Those pine trees are creating that mulch for that entire bed. So that pine straw, that's all from those trees. They just let it fall and then they just keep it there. Some of the stuff that might fall in that St. Augustine grass that's around it, they may just plump back out into that bed. And those really nice is that pine straw, it breaks down, it actually helps keep that soil a little acidic. Which is really beneficial to a lot of our plant material. So that's a great example, but it could be like you drop all your leaves, oak leaves are totally fine. Any leaf from any tree is totally appropriate. unless it's invasive, of course. So oak leaves, maple leaves, anything. So during the fall, when you have deciduous trees drop their leaves, use them to your benefit, recycle them back into your landscape, use them as mulch, because that breaks down and it provides nutrients. Or if you want to try it, you can always do composting, where you can collect those leaves. You can get your grass clippings, pick them up if you wanted to, and you can kind of tumble them all together, and that'll slowly create this nutrient-rich soil, because all those leaves, all that yard waste, it will actually break down and help your soil and your other plants tremendously. So whenever I see like big bags of yard waste out on the road to get picked up, my heart breaks a little bit, because that is great landscape matter to use for the most part. Sometimes you got to get rid of some of the stuff like big branches, logs, etc., that you can't control. But all that provides a great nutrients to your soil. So recycling that in some capacity. I actually knew some Master Gardener volunteers when I was in Alachua County. No one has admitted this to me yet here in Nassau, but I knew some Master Gardeners that on the day where people would put their landscape trash out, you know, those big compost bags, they would actually go by and they pick up a couple of themselves and they take it back to their compost pile. Because they're like, oh, this is great. So they'll take it back and they'll use it and they'll build healthy soil and they'll use it for their gardens, their raised vegetable beds, you name it. Because a lot of that nutrient waste, that yard waste, we can use it to be beneficial. And one of the big concerns that we see a lot is a lot of that yard waste breaks down. And we see it, and as it breaks down, it releases the nutrients rather back to our soil and to our plants. It can break down and take those nutrients out to our water bodies. And one of the big things is grass clippings, yard waste, tree leaves, whatever it might be that are in the roadway that end up in a storm drain, because it goes right to our water bodies and that breaks down and releases tons of nutrients. And that contributes to those green algal blooms. So anytime, like even if there's leaves just falling from a tree, if you're noticing that leaves or grass clippings or whatever it is that's in the roadway, blow it back up into the grass, up into the landscape. You know, let your grass clippings lie where they're at, mulch them in place on the landscape, and let that break down there, because those plants are just going to recycle that and reuse it, rather than getting broken down somewhere else or releasing out to the water bodies. And someone put in a good comment that says that, you know, I don't recommend going out and just grabbing people's yard waste bags, you know, because you got to be careful what's in it. So I knew Master Gardeners that would do it. You don't know what kind of weed seeds that you can end up introducing, or if there's invasive plants in there that you don't know what's introducing. So don't go grab someone's compost bag or bag that's on the curb. I don't actually recommend that at all. But you and your landscape, you have good control in knowing and understanding what's there. So if you can use that to your advantage, let it recycle. So I have a question that says, do I have a session on composting? Yes, I do have one on composting. I just don't have it scheduled currently, but it's going to be one that we do in the future. So let's go ahead and jump to principle number 8, and that is reduce stormwater runoff. So reducing stormwater runoff. So, you know, I see this happen. One of my other landscaping pet peeves is you see irrigation watering concrete and roadways. They don't need that to grow. It's not necessary. So, you know, that's one thing that's like that relates to reducing stormwater runoff or irrigating efficiently. But, you know, thinking about the storms and all the stormwater runoff, the amount of water that we do have, how can we use excess of water to our benefit? It's like cisterns, rain barrels, etc. Because if we can manage that water that's within our landscapes, we can reduce how much ends up in our water bodies. And there's some really cool creative ways that you can get by with that. You know, even if it's like I have a rain garden where all my stormwater goes to this one kind of little spot in my yard and it infiltrates down, that's huge. That's a huge improvement, because it helps clean the water and it helps recharge the groundwater versus going to a storm drain and out to a water body, etc. So there's different cool strategic ways that we can help reduce stormwater and use it in our landscapes. And the ninth principle is protecting the waterfront. So protecting the waterfront, this statement with the FFL program specifically relates to maintaining a 10-foot no maintenance buffer around water bodies, because those plants around those water bodies, they will help intercept and collect any type of nutrient runoff that's coming from upshore. So, where you see turf grass going right down to water bodies, that is not recommended, because grass clippings end up in the water, nutrients end up in the water. There's no buffer of control. So this 10-foot maintenance-free buffer, which you can make look really, really nice, helps intercept a lot of that runoff before it ends up into our water bodies. But I also like to always say is not are you just living, if this is something you need to consider yourself if you're maintaining landscape that's right on the water body, or a waterfront. But I also like to think is I always say, where do you live? So, and then the context of where do you live within a watershed? So we're all part of a big watershed, and a watershed is that area of land where all that water gets funneled to certain locations. We all live on watersheds, and we're all directly connected to water. So whether you live on a waterfront or not, you're still contributing in some capacity to what's happening within that watershed. So it's important that as we're maintaining our landscapes, yes, we have that 10-foot maintenance-free buffer, but we're also thinking about, what am I doing on my landscape? Does it impact water quality in any capacity? What can I do to rectify that and change that? And that's where the FFL program can really help out. So those are the 9 principles. So this is a website that is about to close down, that the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program used to have, called Florida Yards. And it was a really, really neat resource, but they're updating a lot of those resources that you can get. But say you work really hard and you're meeting all these different benchmarks of having a Florida friendly landscape, you can actually get your home recognized. It's a free program that we do through the University of Florida Extension. You can actually get your home recognized as a Florida friendly landscape. There's different levels. There's silver and gold, and we're actually working on a platinum level now. And this relates to homeowners, commercial, new development. We have different evaluations for different types of development types that are using Florida friendly, but homeowners, you can get your yard recognized as an FFL. And it's kind of a cool little thing. You get the certificate, and it's a cool kind of way to, and you get a sign. And we're also working on a flag that you can potentially get. But it's just a really neat way to kind of show to your neighbors and community that you're working, and you have this yard that's recognized, and it helps communicate the need and awareness of the program. But to talk a little bit about the state statute, so there is a state statute that really talks about Florida friendly, and it's Florida Statute 373185, but it says deed restrictions, covenants, or local ordinances cannot prohibit implementation of Florida friendly practices. And it's not assigned to a specific agency. It's not really enforced by court system. It is difficult to determine what is and is not FFL, because the program can be broad and subjective. But this is kind of that state statute that exists that people will talk about. Essentially, if you have, the easiest way I can think about a good example of where the statute kind of works easily is, say there's an example where you're in a community that requires you to use cypress mulch. Well, cypress is not a Florida friendly plant. And you want to use like pine straw or pine bark, they can't tell you that you can't adopt that Florida friendly principle of using that pine straw or pine bark, because that cypress or cedar mulch is not Florida friendly. But say you're in a community that says you have to use pine bark. Well, that's a Florida friendly option, so you have to use pine bark, even if, say, you wanted to use pine straw, but pine bark is considered Florida friendly. So, there's that's the easiest way to explain the state statute in a very simple nutshell, but it does exist. And there's been, you've probably seen on the news, lawsuits between homeowners, HOAs, et cetera. And there are HOA restrictions on FFL. So thinking about it, like deed restrictions and covenants are in place to protect property values and often dictate specific FFL, specific plants from the FFL list that homeowners must use. So like St. Augustine grass, say you wanted to use zoysia instead. Well, St. Augustine grass in a certain situation is considered a Florida friendly. So you would have to use it. But say your community is really, really shaded. There's a huge, there's a lot of canopy coverage and it's just too shady of a landscape. They can't require you to have St. Augustine because there's not enough sun. It would not be considered the right plant for the right place. So we kind of ran through those principles, but this is that crash course. This is kind of the introduction to those 9 principles and what the Florida Friendly program is. So we come back, loop back around to these essential questions. So you should be able to answer to yourself, what is the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program? So this is really that statewide program. It's those 9 principles that help determine what are the best ways for us to manage our landscapes. And it's important. So the second question, it's important because the use of this program helps protect Florida's water quality and quantity, and can help support biodiversity, especially during the habitat loss. So there's a lot of different ways that we can get and implement and adopt Florida friendly in our landscapes or our communities. You know, whether you're an HOA, think about all those common spaces, your backyard, your front yard, it doesn't really matter, but there's so many different ways that we can implement it. And it's important to think that the County Extension Office, I'm here to help support you all as a homeowner, as a community association, if you're a landscape board, doesn't matter. You know, I want to be able to help support you all and help work towards these Florida friendly principles or these different choices or behaviors that you can make that are science-based and from the research that we do through the university. So always think of, use the Extension Office as a outlet. Reach out to us for questions. We have the Master Gardener Help Desk. You can always give us a call. We have kind of multiple offices. Our main office is in Callahan over at the fairgrounds. Our new office is under construction. It's over on Minor Road, just off of 200. But you know, use us as a resource. Give us a call or just reach out directly to me. Here is my contact information. You can shoot me an email. That's my direct line. And here's some of our, like, we have a Facebook page, Instagram page, and we also have a YouTube channel where we're recording a lot of these webinars and any other videos that they go put up there. So this is being recorded and this will be sent to you all with some additional information as a follow-up, you know, in the next couple of days with some of the resources that are related to today's topic. So feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you do have. And I have a couple of questions that popped up in the chat box and the Q&A, but before I address those and before we open up the floor to other questions, I want to show you a couple of those online resources from the university that are super helpful, I think. So let me kind of get them in place. One moment. I have it pseudo prepped. Just got to move things around. And right. So this is the statewide Florida Friendly Landscaping page. And it has a bunch of resources, and I'll send you some of these key resources that are through this page. But there's a whole section that's out like for home landscapes, community landscapes, landscape professionals. And then you can jump into more detail about each one of the principles, which is super, super handy. But the resources that I really like, you can come up here. Oh no, where is it? Oh, there it is. I don't know what I was looking at. I was on the wrong tab. So come to resources and we have a bunch of free online apps that you can go to. And this one I really, really like. So there's a plant guide, there's a fertilizer ordinance because some counties have specific fertilizer ordinances. You can look up information about toxic plants. And then there's also an app we have about butterfly gardens. But the FFL plant guide, this is going to be a great tool for that selection of plant material for right plant, right place. So you can open it up in a browser or your phone. It doesn't matter. It's easy to do. So you can come in here and it'll load. There's a little filter at the bottom where you can select, okay, so plant type. We're going to run through an example. I want a small shrub, and the plant shape is different shapes that you can choose from, but we're not going to worry about that. But we need something that's part shade. We're in 8B, and say we want it to attract the different pollinators and maybe hummingbirds. Salt tolerance, we'll say it has to have it like a little bit of salt tolerance. Flower color, that's up to you if you want it in a native status. Florida friendly doesn't necessarily mean native plants only, but you can definitely use 100% native in a Florida friendly landscape. So we'll just hit filter and we'll see what pops up. Well, apparently it didn't work. Maybe I got too specific. It's not liking my plant choices for some reason. Am I missing something? Okay, I think it was a salt tolerance was really messing us up. But so based off of those plant selections, like, oh, here's some really good plants that you can go out that grow out really well in those conditions. So, and then you can click on them like, oh, a butterfly bush. This is a wonderful plant. So you can open it up. It has a couple pictures and then it shows information about growing conditions, the yard conditions in which it does well, and then information about how big it gets. So more detail. And I also like the flowering months. So when will it be flowering is kind of a little handy. And then, does it have pest diseases? What does it attract, etc. So this is an easy, simple way that you can end up finding plants for your landscape, and so ornamental grasses. Here, let's just filter out some of these ornamental grasses and see what we can get. So river oats, I love river oats. That's a beautiful plant. Muley grass, that's blooming right now. It's a great native. Fakahatchee grass, that's another wonderful plant. So this is a great tool that you can use to help find plants for your landscapes. We also have the IFAS assessment webpage. This is that webpage that I was telling you all about earlier that talks about invasive status of plants. So if you're ever curious, it's running slow, but if you want to kind of determine, is this plant considered invasive or not, this is that website that you can go to. So some good examples. All right, we live in a north section, conclusion type, it's considered invasive. And there's even some that's like, it's caution, it's not necessarily invasive, but we wouldn't necessarily recommend planting it yet or planting it anymore. So you can apply those filters and all of a sudden it's going to show all those plants that meet these specific conditions that grow in our area. So you can look at this and it can be kind of like a little list that you can look at nonetheless. So, or if there's specific plants that you want to look up. So you can search it on this website and you can look up its invasive status. So those are two little handy things that you can use. But anyways, so let me go ahead and open back up my contact information. And then what we'll do is we'll be able to open it up for answering some questions and open the floor for any questions that you all have, because we have about 15 minutes left in the scheduled program. So let's see here. So any questions that you have, feel free to put it into the chat box in the Q&A. And I'm going to follow up with the information, of course, as well as I have an evaluation survey, but that evaluation survey is going to come in that follow-up email because it's a little bit slightly different than the ones I do in previous programs. So one question I do have is, let's see, it's kind of like a little scenario. It says, we have a small conservation space behind our backyard. It provides privacy from other homes and is home to wildlife. Cool. Several of the trees have fallen during the last 2 hurricanes. We would like to plant a few fast-growing trees to repopulate the space. It is not irrigated and is sunny. Any recommendations? All right, so fast-growing trees. How wet is that site? Can you respond? Can you put in the chat box what that moisture level is like in that? And that kind of makes, it kind of reminds me of, so like dead trees that haven't fallen over or trees that are broken, those actually provide wonderful habitat for wildlife. Assuming they're not going to like fall on a home or a property. So in those situations, is like attracts birds and insects and all sorts of biodiversity when you have tree snags or dead fallen branches or trees that are in a landscape or a conservation area. So if you could put in that, is it wet back there or not? Like, we need to be careful about what kind of plants are like fast growing plants. Sometimes those fast growing plants also means it does not have wind resistance. So, but there are some good native plants that could grow well back there, like a red maple, and some of our native elms could be good ones. Like I believe the winged elm is a moderately to fast growing elm, and it's native, and same with the red maple. Red maple is I think a little bit slower than that winged elm. So those are good potential trees that you could put into that space that could be able to get established without too much irrigation. But during times of drought, you're going to have to hit it with some water to help encourage those roots to kind of spring out into the soil around it, especially if it's dry during a dry time of year. Okay. Oh, the area is sandy. It is not overly wet. Okay. So that winged elm might be a little bit better. The cypress always work well because they're very adaptable. But that winged elm could be a good one. The red maple might work still, but does prefer a little bit extra water compared to the winged elm. One question that popped up in the chat box that I have, it says, well water, is it harmful for irrigation? Does dollarweed spread more when mowed mulch back into lawn by lawnmower? And is there a bad milkweed versus good milkweed plant? Oh man, so that's a lot of questions. I'll answer one by one. So is well water harmful for irrigation? No. It's not going to be harmful. The only issue that you'll end up finding is a lot of the well water that you pull up is going to be higher in iron. That's not going to bother your plants, but it could clog some of your irrigation system. So you may have to clear it out or clean it out periodically, which is possible to do. But it's usually like if you get iron buildup in the misters or the sprayers, etc., that can clog them and they don't work as effectively. The second part is, does dollarweed spread more when mowed and mulched back into lawn by lawnmower? No, it does not. There are some plants though that as you mow it, it encourages growth, but dollarweed's not going to be one of them. Is there a bad milkweed versus a good milkweed? So there are native milkweeds. I would 100% recommend those in any capacity over like the tropical milkweed. And we've learned a lot over the past few years about tropical milkweed. It still is great for monarchs. All milkweeds are great for monarchs. But what happens is tropical milkweeds do not die back in the winter like our natives do. And because of that happening, we find that it disrupts the monarch population migration. And as well, because of that persistence with it, monarchs will come into a cool season and then bam, they're killed by a cold snap. But also there's a little protist that can exist, or an amoeba, I can't remember, I think amoeba maybe, that ends up persisting on that tropical milkweed that can cause birth defects in the monarchs. But that doesn't happen in those native ones because it dies back. So if you do have that tropical milkweed, I highly encourage you to make sure you cut it back starting in October, November, and make sure it stays cut back until March, April. So the native ones are going to be best, but monarchs don't differentiate. I would avoid using tropical milkweed if possible. Oh yeah, and regarding the tree establishment, you can always get a tree diaper where you fill it up periodically. That can help with plant establishment. Good recommendation. Yeah. Ooh. Okay. So should you cut down? Oh, should you cut down now the butterfly milkweed? I couldn't think of the name. Also, it's right here. Should you cut down the milkweed now? No, you don't have to cut it down, but next month you should probably think about cutting it down. And one question is, do I have a recommendation of plants to help get rid of gnats? You could theoretically include carnivorous plants that can eat on gnats, like pitcher plants and stuff like that. You know, they're great for like bog gardens, etc. But there are not going to be any plants specifically for controlling and getting rid of gnats, but carnivorous plants will help a little bit. Usually we're thinking about how do we get rid of the gnats, what's causing them in the first place, and how do we fix that, if possible. Some things are completely out of our control. What can, so this is a big question. This is a simple question, but it's a very big question. It is, what can we do with developers to move towards Florida friendly landscapes? So that's a very big question. So there's a couple strategies that can happen. There's always policy changes. How does code and ordinances dictate how land use is developed through like unified land development codes? That can dictate that. It can be done through education with a lot of those developers, but one of the big barriers that we have identified through some of the research that we've done is a lot of developers, they're only involved with that very beginning of the development. So when you start thinking about where some of those cost savings can occur with Florida friendly landscapes, it's going to be when the developer has already moved on from a project where they are no longer in control. So they're usually looking at that reducing overhead to make money. And what happens if all of a sudden they have to do a lot of different landscape management decisions that isn't easy for them to do quickly and isn't cost effective? Either it's going to hyperinflate home costs, or it's going to minimize their it's going to greatly improve their overhead, and it's going to minimize their profit. So it becomes a really strange gray area, because I know developers that I've worked with that try to implement Florida friendly, and they do, but very minimally, you know, because of that cost. What can they get? You know, thinking about improving a diversity of plant material in a landscape, you know, a developer or builder, they need thousands of different types of plants. And it's hard to find very specific diverse plants at that quantity. So then you're also looking at the supply chain. So there is a demand. There is a demand, but the supply might not always be there, in a way that can be cost effective. So it's really difficult to do, but we are working on that. One project I've worked on in the past is actually with that developer I was mentioning. They are creating a community that is completely Florida friendly. No irrigation. They're actually not installing any irrigation at all. And we're hoping to use that as a model because they're able to make it affordable housing community where all the homes are less than 200,000. So they're making an affordable housing community and making it Florida friendly. And part of the things that has really made it hard for them to sometimes do that is the county policy and code. The requirements that they need to do super exceeds their and increases their overhead. So it's a lot of different players that go into it. But education and awareness, that's the biggest thing with homeowners and stakeholder groups, is how can we educate them to say, what can we do better to help improve this process, whether it's step by step, or, you know, what are the little things that we can do, those low hanging fruits. That's always the one steps that we can do that's can have big impacts with limited impact on their overhead, etc. So that's a really big topic. So hopefully I answered it just a little bit. One question that came in the chat box is, can the scale be controlled on sago palms? So there is a pretty nasty scale that can come into your sago palms that like turn it white. So yes and no. So there is some thoughts that coffee grounds, we're still doing some research, actually do that. You know, like your spent coffee grounds can actually help control that scale on your sago. The one control method that is effective, is it going to be 100% control? It's no guarantee, but it's doing a combination of, you do a neem oil application, you treat that sago with neem, you wait a day or so, let it work its magic on the scale, you spray it off with a hose, so you're knocking off all scale that's dead, or any of the, once you knock down adult scales, they can't climb back up onto the plant. And then let it dry, and you do another neem oil application, and you kind of do that rotation until you get it under control. So it's a little intensive, but the scale on sago is kind of difficult. But using that neem oil and water will get you there. And we're learning, there is some research about the coffee, but there's no data that actually supports it yet, just anecdotal. Yeah, so doing that neem, you have to do multiple applications to get good control. It takes a while, so it can work, just very, very slowly. There are some crazy insecticides that you can spray on it from a homeowner perspective. I don't think you can get, you don't have access to it. Oh, that's a really good question. So with all the rain, I'm seeing black mold on several plants. Will a fungicide take care of that? So I'm going to show something. Let me pull this picture up. I'm going to search it so I don't give it away. I'm going to search it first before I show it to you all. Ah, there we go. Okay. Here it is. Doing a lot of crazy share screens today. So does it kind of look like this, or is it like or it could be thicker where it's just like a complete black coverage of the leaf, or it's almost like a weird film on top of the leaf? Does it kind of look like that a little bit? Have any of you seen something like this before? So this is what we call this sooty mold, and this is very common. This is very common on our landscape plants, especially this time of year. And the sooty mold is actually, it's a mold, not a fungus, that is growing on, and here's an example, that's actually growing on insect poop. And it's actually rather benign to the plant, but it's just an indicator that there's a pest issue within that plant. So to cause that sooty mold to grow. So it's common to see. And you know, if it doesn't necessarily look like that, and if it is a fungus, then I recommend sending the images to me, or the name of the plant and what it looks like, because that can really dictate what's the best control. So like copper fungicides and neem oil can actually really help out with majority of the fungus that we have in the landscape, but it ultimately depends on the plant type to get the best control. But sooty mold, yeah, I mean, I saw it today on some plants, on crepe myrtles. I saw it all over some of them. And It was like, well, they have a pest problem. Probably bark lice is what it's called. So that's a very common insect for crepe myrtles, not real lice. All right. Are there any other questions anybody has? Oh, will the scale on that sago jump to other plants? So no, that's usually scale you'll find to on specific plants for specific plants, and they don't necessarily always transfer. So this specific cycad that we're talking about, it is, oh, let me pull up the actual name of it. I think it's called just like the white Asian cycad or the Asian cycad. Yeah, just Asian cycad scale. It usually just staying on those sago palms. You could see it get to your Kunti plants or other types of cycads, but they usually kind of stay put to where they're located. They don't travel too much from that sago. But good question. Yeah. So a lot of our pests, they actually usually target specific plants. There's some that will move around between different ones, but they usually have they target very specific plants. All right. Are there any other questions anybody has? Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And look out for all of our upcoming extension programs. We'll send out emails through our listserv, social media, et cetera, to kind of keep everybody connected about programs that we have coming up. We should be starting to release our October dates coming here soon. But I'm really excited that we're able to present these programs to you all, but always feel free to reach out to the County Extension Office if you have any questions. And we will be sending this recording out to all of you and everybody that registered for this program. So thank you all very much for attending today.